Chapter 13, Reformations and Religious Wars. Part 2, The Spread of Protestant Ideals.
Play me off, Johnny!
When talking about the Reformation, we have to also understand the politics of the time period. The reform movements that were going on within these church groups was more easily suppressed with strong central governments like you saw in Spain and in France during the 16th century. But the Holy Roman Empire, as a diverse collection of states under the nominal rule of the Holy Roman Emperor, it was much more difficult to contain the spread of ideas. Another important factor is the election of the Habsburg Prince Charles V as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Earlier, the Holy Roman Emperor was Frederick III. He acquired a small amount of territory and a great deal of money with his marriage to Princess Eleanor of Portugal in 1452. In 1477, Frederick's son Maximilian married Europe's most powerful heiress, Mary of Burgundy.
Marriage.
This union merged the rich and powerful Duchy of Burgundy to the Austrian House of Habsburg, already one of the strongest ruling families in the empire.
But I don't like her.
Don't like her? What's wrong with her? She's beautiful, she's rich, she's got huge tracts of land.
Further unions between Maximilian's children and the children of Ferdinand and Isabella meant that their grandson, Charles V, inherited a vast and incredibly diverse collection of states and people, each one of them governed in a different manner and held together only by the person of the emperor. Charles was a devout Catholic, and he was convinced that it was his duty to maintain the political and religious unity of Western Christendom. Luther was able to play upon those national feelings within the Holy Roman Empire. Many German rulers who were otherwise confused or indifferent to the complexity of religious matters were attracted to Luther's message. Some rulers also just generally were attracted to Lutheran ideas, but many saw this as a way of opposing Charles V. Charles V, as a staunch defender of Catholicism, meant that war was likely to happen. In Switzerland, it was divided into 13 cantons. These are what they called their provinces. Some remained Catholic, while others became Protestant. And in the late 1520s, the two sides went to war. Ulrich Zwingli was actually killed in the battlefield in 1531, and both sides agreed to a treaty that would allow each canton to determine its own religion and ordered each side to give up its foreign alliances. This policy of neutrality is what Switzerland is most known for today.
We have to put the board in a neutral place where no one will tamper with it.
So that's here?
Yes, you're like Switzerland.
I don't want to be Switzerland.
To halt the spread of religious division, Charles V called an imperial diet in 1530. This is later going to be called the Augsburg Confession, and this is where Protestant princes presented the Lutheran statement of faith to the emperor. What happened in the aftermath is a period of bloody warfare in the Holy Roman Empire, and finally in 1555, Charles agrees to the Peace of Augsburg, which officially recognized Lutheranism. It permitted the political authority in each territory to decide whether the territory would be Catholic or Lutheran, and ordered that territories be allowed to practice their faiths in peace. There really is no freedom of religion, though, within the territories. Dissidents had to convert or leave. Religious refugees were a common feature during the middle 16th century. But another important thing is that Charles V abdicates the throne just a year later. And this is where he's going to split his empire into two halves, with the Spanish line going to his son and the Austrian line going to his brother. The first area outside the Holy Roman Empire to officially accept the Reformation was the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway under King Christian III. Danish scholars had been studying at the University of Wittenberg, and Lutheran ideas had spread into Denmark very quickly. In the 1530s, the king officially broke with the Catholic Church, and most of the clergy followed. In northern Norway and Iceland, which Christian also ruled, reactions were more violent, and Lutheranism was only gradually imposed on this largely unwilling populace. In Sweden, Gustavus Vasa came to the throne during a civil war with Denmark. Gustavus then took control of the church personnel and income, and Protestant ideas were spread throughout the rest of the Scandinavian peninsula. The Swedish church, though, did not officially accept Lutheran theology until later in the 16th century.
I'm Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII, I am.
Henry VIII, of course, is important for the formation of the Church of England. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon and had produced only one living heir, a daughter, Mary. So Henry appealed to the Pope to have his marriage annulled. Pope Clement VII, though, was in a tricky situation. He was under extreme pressure from Charles V, who was the nephew of Catherine, and was vigorously opposed to an annulment. So Pope Clement VII attempted to take no action. Eventually, Henry got tired of waiting, and he dissolved the English monasteries, taking the land for himself, and created a new bureaucratic machinery to manage the formerly monastic lands. So Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, reformed, centralized the king's household, the council, the secretariat, and the exchequer, and set up new departments. Surplus funds went into a fund to be applied to deficits, resulting in greater efficiency and economy, as well as growth of a centralized bureaucratic state. Most clergy and officials accepted Henry's moves. Again, there had been a tradition of reform within the English Catholic Church for a while, but in 1536, popular opposition in the north led to the Pilgrimage of Grace. This was a massive rebellion that proved to be the largest in English history. The Pilgrims eventually accepted a truce, but their leaders were arrested, tried, and executed. People rarely converted to Protestantism overnight. Most reacted to an action of the crown in the neighborhood with a combination of resistance, acceptance, and collaboration. On the other hand, most Irish people remained Roman Catholic even after the Irish Parliament severed ties with Rome and established the Church of Ireland on the English pattern. This added religious antagonism to the ethnic hostility that had been a feature of England's policy towards Ireland for centuries. And this pattern of nationalism being played out through religious conflict is going to get repeated in many other settings in Europe. England is going to respond very harshly, trying to repress this armed opposition to the Reformation. They confiscate and sell a lot of the Catholic property, and this results in a massive transfer of wealth from Ireland back into England.
Second verse, same as the first.
Henry's only son, Edward VI, is going to take over after Henry VIII passes away. He is still a child, and so regents are going to largely rule in his place, and England is going to take a much more hardline Protestant stance under his rule. Edward had always been a sickly child, and he dies very younger. And so Mary Tudor, who is devoutly Catholic and is very upset at the way that her mother was treated, comes to power in 1553. She's going to rescind most of the Reformation legislation of her father's reign. She's going to restore Catholicism, and she's going to execute several hundred Protestants, which is going to earn her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary is also going to pass away, and that's going to leave Henry VIII's only surviving child, Elizabeth Tudor, to take over. Elizabeth was a very shrewd ruler. This is part of what is going to allow her to be the longest reigning monarch until that record is eclipsed by Elizabeth II here in just recent time. She's able to find this middle path between the two extremes, and the Anglican Church, as the Church of England was called, is going to become the official Church of England under her rule, and that is going to be firmly established. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Elizabeth's Catholic cousin and next in line to the English throne, became implicated in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. This conspiracy had a full backing of Philip II of Spain. When the English arrested and executed Mary, the Catholic Pope urged Philip to retaliate, and he attempted to do this by sending a vast fleet across the English Channel to attack England. This is known as the Spanish Armada.
I will invade England with the most terrible force of battleships ever seen. I shall call it the most terrible force of battleships ever seen.
Or you could call it the Armada, Your Majesty.
Yes, catchy.
It feels better.
On May 9th, 1588, the Spanish Armada met an English fleet of ships that were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable, but they carried greater firepower. A combination of storms and squalls, spoiled food, rank water, inadequate Spanish ammunition, and English fire ships gave England a victory that really enhanced English national sentiment. The defeat of the Spanish Armada prevented Philip II from reimposing Catholicism on England by force. This moment in time is often seen as the point at which England surpasses Spain as a major power on the European stage. Another major thinker in the Reformation was John Calvin. He was born in 1509, and he studied law, which had a decisive impact on his mind and later his thought. In 1533, though, he experiences a religious crisis, and he converts to Protestantism. Calvin believed that God had specifically selected him to reform the church, and beginning in 1541, he worked to establish a Christian society in Geneva in which the church and state would act together. The cornerstone of Calvin's theology was the Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536. He had an absolute belief in the omnipotence of God and the total weakness of humanity. This led to a belief in predestination. Calvin did not believe humans had free will, and he ascribed to the theological principle called predestination. Men and women cannot actively work to achieve salvation. Rather, God in his infinite wisdom decided at the beginning of the time who would be saved and who would be damned. The most powerful organization in Calvin's Geneva was the consistory. It was a body of laymen and pastors who were charged with investigating and disciplining deviations from proper doctrine and conduct. Geneva would become the model of a Christian community, and it attracted religious refugees from France, England, Spain, Scotland, and Ireland. Subsequently, the Church of Calvin served as the model for the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the Huguenot Church in France, and the Puritan Church in England and later New England. Calvinism really becomes the most dynamic force in international Protestantism, spreading throughout the continent of Europe. John Knox is going to be the dominant figure of the Reform movement in Scotland, and he's determined to establish a state church there, and it's a structure that was modeled after Geneva, where he had studied and worked with Calvin. Knox persuaded the Scottish Parliament to end papal authority and rule by bishops, and instead establish governments by presbyters or councils of ministers. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland was strictly Calvinist in doctrine. Ethnic factors often determined the course of the Reformation in Eastern Europe. The Hussite Czechs in Bohemia were already willing to see reforms within the church, and Lutheranism appealed to Germans in Bohemia in the 1520s and 1530s. The nobility there embraced Lutheranism in opposition to the Catholic Habsburgs. In Poland, though, ordinary Poles saw this as German influence on their culture, and so Poland is going to become Roman Catholic and remain Roman Catholic by 1650, which is still the case to this day. Hungary's experience with the Reformation is even more complex. Lutheranism was spread by Hungarian students who had studied at Wittenberg, and there was a sympathy for it developing in the court of King Louis II. However, its status as the German heresy was an issue until the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman crushed the Hungarians in 1526 and divided the Hungarian kingdoms into three parts. In the face of Turkish indifference to the religious conflicts of Christians, whom they regarded as infidels and required to pay an extra tax to the Sultan just because they were Christian, Many Magyar or Hungarian nobles accepted Lutheranism. The majority of people in Hungary were Protestant until the late 17th century, when Hungarian nobles recognized the Habsburg Catholic rule as opposing the Ottoman Turks. And so when the Turks withdraw in 1699, leads to a Christian and Catholic restoration in the territory of Hungary.